how addiction really plagues all of us.
Yeah.
And to different extents and to different levels. Every single person has had some kind of experience being addicted to food or alcohol or drugs or sex or porn or the cell phone even, which is probably the most common addiction of them all. And I think I just wanted to get your views on, firstly, how we define it in our society, because there's so much stigma around being labeled as an addict of any kind. So even if you raise the topic with somebody where you see them going through some kind of addiction pattern that you know is toxic for them, if you say, oh, you're addicted, immediately there's like this defensive response, which is quite human, quite natural to have that response. Nobody wants to be labeled an addict. Definitely. So, just understanding how we even define it. I know in the Western psychology world, there's a certain definition, but obviously coming from an energy healing point of view, I'm going to challenge that definition a little bit. But I think it's important to have these conversations to understand just firstly the stigma and how people get around that so they can actually help themselves to heal and transcend whatever addiction is plaguing their lives. And I think the first step is just coming into a place of acceptance about that pattern. And it doesn't have to be this terrible, evil stigma. So maybe you want to just enlighten me on your points of view about the way the Western world defines addiction, firstly, the labels around it and the stigma maybe.
I've always been interested in context. It's a very important way in which we need to view models and the way they're viewed. And actually one of the philosophical people that I always used to follow, he's actually a French historian, Michel Foucault. He often talks about how we use institutionalization and psychiatric admissions over the years, and we actually made people feel weak through that process. We disempowered people and we took power away from them. Whereas in the Renaissance period, you see paintings romanticizing what we call madness today, what we call people that are a little bit different. And the connotations of people being weak and stuff is very much shaped by the Western world. If you look at the Diagnostic Statistics Manual, edition 5 that was made in 2013, you'll see that, the way they view it is that it's always going to be an impairment. It's always going to create an impairment and it's always going to create a problem. And of course, addiction is, right? It is a problem. But the way in which we view addiction is often inextricably tied to society and the view of addiction. Whereas addiction obviously is a personal journey and a personal battle we all go through, right? It's a problem that we might have biologically, emotionally, and socially that we kind of have an issue with.
Okay.
So I get exactly what you're saying. And so firstly, just with the views of addiction and how it's viewed, like it's definitely within the Western scope of things. And we need to actually understand it on a more personal level via context.
Right. So I personally always associate addiction with a type of numbing. Or whatever the addiction is, whether you are consciously aware of the pattern that you have or not, it is actually a type of numbing of oneself and avoiding whatever pain or trauma lies beneath the triggers that are causing you to run for that feel-good something. And so I can relate because I once had a shopping addiction. I once had a terrible shopping addiction, and I think consumerism, which is so heavily marketed, as well as vapes and brands and food, even support those kinds of toxic habit forming. But at the end of the day, we're searching for something to numb and just put a plaster on, not dealing with the real cause, the real root cause underneath. For all of us going through this journey of, firstly, am I addicted to something? Do I have a bad habit that is starting to consume my life, that is out of balance? And then the effects of that, whether it is a gambling addiction that's causing you to have gross financial losses, or a food addiction that's causing you to become physically unhealthy, or whatever the addiction might be, it has such, like you said, such negative repercussions on our lives that we have no choice but to face them head on. What are some of the things that people can do just to come face to face with that numbing, that desire that comes up?
Yeah.
I mean, for me, I have awareness, which I would say at the top of my mind. Coming into a state of awareness where you can observe yourself has probably been the most profound thing for me. Because in that moment, you're able to stop this runaway habit that's almost on autopilot.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on how we catch ourselves in that moment?
That's actually a fantastic reflection, firstly, because when it comes to these elements of addiction, the thing is that when people view quitting an addiction and getting through an addiction, it's usually the idea of willpower, right? Ironically, you're using your prefrontal cortex for decision-making and executive decision-making and willpower, essentially, right? But what's essentially lacking in your body is dopamine. Now, dopamine is the neurochemical for motivation, and it's highly associated with any sort of addictive use when it comes to behavioral or substances. I think one of the things as well that you mentioned that sparked my brain is because when you think about substance use, everyone always seems to view that alone. But behavioral addictions are just as pronounced, and they're actually becoming more and more of an excruciating factor within society today. So with all of that in mind, right, when dopamine's lacking, the thing that you need to do in terms of dealing with an addiction and working with an addiction is awareness. Inner awareness is the power within. That's where you can actually seek an understanding of what's happening in your mind, because you'll find that, the physical withdrawals of gambling or even substance use or any kind of thing, internet, gaming addiction, anything like that, the physical stuff after a week will kind of die down, or after like 4 weeks, say, at most. And at the end of the day, the psychological addiction's still there. And you need to be aware of what's happening so that you can be aware of what your internal narrative is trying to tell you. That it's actually not necessarily the right thing for you, and that there might be other ways in which you can attain that dopamine through healthier mechanisms,
Right.
where we're not using denial as a defense mechanism, but we're using rationalization. We're using sublimation like gym. Rationalization could be like journaling or meditating or doing some form of self-awareness techniques in which you can get calmer within the body. You'll find that your body can actually generate a lot of dopamine without you engaging in these habitual processes.
Yeah.
And ironically, back to the dopamine, I know I'm talking a lot about dopamine
No,
and all of
it's
that
a
stuff.
fascinating subject.
Yeah. When it comes to the motivation neurochemical of dopamine, you must remember that we adapted this through our ancestors. Our ancestors needed to go out, get food, go out and get water.
Hunter-gatherist,
Exactly.
hunter-gatherer age.
Exactly. And that's where dopamine was created. If we didn't have dopamine, we'd just be depressed people lying down on the floor and enjoying the sun, And we probably wouldn't even want sun, because the sun also creates dopamine inside of the mind, physiologically
Right.
speaking. So the thing is, when you start engaging in that substance to the point of compulsion, that's where it becomes maladaptive. That's where it becomes a problem. And that's where eventually you won't even start using dopamine. It will actually go into the habit circuitry of your brain, which is where endocannabinoids are involved. So ironically...
Now, what does endocannabinoids mean?
Sorry, it's a little bit associated with different things, but it's more towards habit. It's more towards habit stuff going on in the circuitry of the brain.
So if I may, Brenton, and I love the scientific explanation, because a lot of people need that to understand what's happening to them medically, and how the body actually physically processes that habit energy, the flow of it. I'm going to speak about it again from a personal point of view of saying the way that I have experienced that energy sitting in my body is very much like a physical hardwired chemical circuit board that you cannot alter or deviate from. And it's a chain reaction. There will be a trigger emotion. I believe firmly that emotion triggers thought, which triggers feeling. But there's a specific energy of that emotion that's sitting in your body and that you're unaware of most of the time. And then you will have these thoughts that emanate from that energy. And these thoughts might be, I'm not good enough. I'm not pretty enough. I need to get something to make me feel more confident, look more, worthy, come across more socially acceptably, whatever the case might be. And, that those feelings that then go with it of feeling really insecure, feeling shame, these triggers all happen in rapid succession, and they almost happen in the exact same way. And if you're able to catch yourself and you're able to observe that pattern, it's fascinating, because that's precisely what will lead you to that habit. And then you go for that numbing agent, whether it's the vape or the porn or whatever your vice might be. And if you're not conscious and you're not paying attention to that pattern, it's very difficult to try and undo it. So for me, like you said, the awareness is key. I think when it comes to